Could I have your attention, please? Hello, everybody. Could we have your attention, please? All right, thank you. And welcome to Calvin Theological Seminary. What a great crowd here in the middle of a winter and a cold winter day. What a really good to see all of you and good to have you here. My name is Dave Morin. I'm currently the chairman of the board of trustees here for the seminary. So warm welcomes from our board. I happen to live in the Grand Rapids area, so I'm able to represent the board at certain times and events like this. We have board members, as you're probably aware, from across our country and Canada. And actually next week we're going to be having our winter board meeting. So I'll be sure to let them know kind of the success, at least, of this lunch and the results of that. We look forward to hearing from Matt later in his new book, and Danny as he kind of interviews him, and what a great blessing that they both are to this institution. So with that, why don't we open with prayer, and we'll get started. Father God, thank you for this day. We thank you for the beauty of a winter day. We thank you for these people, these supporters of the seminary, students that are here, faculty that's here, and especially Professor Matt Tuininga. We thank you for his passion for teaching, for writing. We look forward to his book. Lord, we ask that you just continue to bless the work of the seminary here as their vision and mission is to train the future teachers and leaders of the Christian church. And so we're so grateful for that ministry. So God, thank you for this lunch. Bless these people here. And we look forward to the presentation in your name alone. Amen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jewel Maidenblick, the president of the seminary, and then he will introduce things to move forward.
Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate it. Few housekeeping details. They always give somebody that idea. And one of the housekeeping details is, can you still go get more food and dessert? And the answer is yes, because Dave has not eaten and I have not eaten. So we're going to do that as well. So feel free to get up, and we know that, again, you're going to do it in a quiet way. How many of you, just a brief survey, how many of you, this is your first event in the kind of remodeled Morin Student Center? Would you raise your hand? Wow, that's wonderful. Glad that you're here. Glad that once again you've made your way here to Calvin Theological Seminary. This whole building was remodeled. We started during COVID. They are not correlated. There's no relationship between COVID and the remodeling of this building. But that did take place at the time. And we are grateful for this Morin Student Center that's light and bright and allows us to do events like this. So thank you for all of you for being here. When we did one last year, Bob, Nora, and I go, I guess there are people back in Michigan, even in January and February, when we see many of you in Florida, for example. But we're grateful that you are here. A couple other housekeeping details. I just really think one of the things that we always have to do is just pause and, as Dave and even his prayer, giving thanks. And so I want to give thanks for our development staff who worked hard in sending you information. Bob and Mitch, and you're getting to know Rebecca. You've seen Jean Garahan probably here, because whenever there's an event after her 30-plus years of service, she always likes to keep a good, close eye on us. But the one person who did a lot of this in terms of connections, reservation, is Laura Paulsreich. Would you especially thank her and others for this time? I get to be the bearer of news about, at the end of our program today, and again, it might be reminded again later, that Jean, Laura, and Carolyn Danute are going to be at the book table. And here's how it works. If you made a reservation before the 12th, there should be a book available for you. If not, and they have it in all caps, there will be no extra books. That's what we've been told. And you can go to Amazon or Oxford University Press. And there's ways that we might be able to work it. But I'm just trying to help expedite the line and also the expectations for this moment. We'd hate to have this event end where we talk about the War of the Lords and there's a book fight. So we're not going to do that, are we? Okay. So again, remember that. And again, feel free to take part in the fellowship. One of the things that we want to highlight is that at the end of this, we think you might want to learn more. about the conversations that Matt and Danny will be leading. And both of them have been featured in recent podcasts that's part of our forum publication, but also now our platform. So many of you know the forum, and we recently sent out a new forum that has the title, Where Have All the Pastors Gone? And there's a number of articles in here that once again invite you to, if you don't receive it, that brings me to the second part of this, which is that we have an opportunity for you by the book table. You can stop by and get something from Calvin Seminary, and that's an opportunity for you to pick up one of these. It says, We Exist to Serve the Church. Inside there's a QR code, but also a way for you to fill out a card that allows you to us to communicate with you, and for you to be on that forum list, that forum podcast, and forum platform as well. And again, there is even in this forum on page 70 an article that features Professor Matt Tuininga. And so again, if you've not gotten that, take the opportunity at the book table, get something from Calvin Seminary, even if it's not a book. You got it at lunch today, but also get the opportunity to connect with us in terms of the forum. When I was asked to not only give the welcome, but a little bit of introduction, I want you to think about the fact, for many of you, as I look around this room, you know a lot of our faculty, and there's President number 5, Jim DeYoung. You see other former faculty members here. We're grateful that they're here, like Lyle Bierma, and I saw John Bolt and Carl Bosma. And so I'm not going to keep going on, because otherwise I'm going to forget somebody, and this feels like right now I've already offended somebody by not noting them. But for us to recognize there's been a blessing with a new chapter as we face 150th anniversary as a seminary, and there's always new chapters. And I've been privileged to be part of some of those moments and those chapters. But I'll first introduce the interviewer, is Professor Danny Daley. Danny Daley came to us a couple years ago. He's one of our professors of New Testament, a colleague of Jeff Wyma. And one of the things that he brings is pastoral experience for a number of years before he went, with the consent of his wife and family, to Europe for about 10 years. And his degrees have included a Master of Theology from the University of Edinburgh, Master of Science from the University of Edinburgh, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Trinity College in Dublin. And again, if you would meet him and his wife and his children, they were glad to come to Grand Rapids, Michigan. I still remember part of the interview was that I found out by talking to Professor Daley that his wife was looking at Zillow, which is meaning you're really serious about coming to Grand Rapids. And he offers a wonderful gift to us in different ways. And he recently also we highlighted his ministry through books with this book, Ideal Disciples, a commentary on Matthew's Beatitudes. And so thank you for that work as well. And when we think about the work of discipleship, then we might want to move forward and say, what does that look like today? And what does it look like in the past? And so grateful for, once again, Professor Matt Tuininga. He is someone who's been here almost 10 years. He's a professor of Christian ethics and the history of Christianity. And so I want you to think about ethics and Christianity, and for the opportunity for him to bring to us a story that is subtitled The Puritan Conquest of America's First People. I had the privilege of reading that manuscript ahead of time. I had a small contribution. I asked Matt, could you get maps in the book? I think that might help. And the reason why is because it helps to orientate people. Where is this happening? And I want to use that image of maps because I think that this book helps orientate us to questions that we're still dealing with. What does it mean to have zeal for the Lord, but also as we relate to other people and even different cultures? And again, we want to leave as much time as possible. That's why we started a little bit early. For us to have a conversation by witnessing and watching over and listening in, overhearing Professor Danny Daley, who has an office on one side that if you go walk right across the hallway is where Professor Matt Tuininga's office is. So I want you to imagine that they're in their hallway, they're in their doorway, and they begin a conversation. And with that, I would like you to welcome them up front and for us to hear this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Jewel, and welcome to you all again. Excited to be here. As Jewel said, my office and Matt's office in the faculty hallway over here face each other. So there are times we're in our offices with our doors open and we literally can lob comments to each other back and forth, which is fun. But I'm also close enough to Matt's office to hear him in his office talking with students. I'm not eavesdropping on purpose or anything, but I can hear him engaging with his students, talking about history, talking about ethics, and I can tell you, I mean, you feel it when you read the book, but I can also just tell you from hearing him in the hallway that he is excited about history, fired up to talk to people about it. Students coming into the office, or whether it's he and I talking about it, he loves this stuff. So I was blessed to be able to ask to participate in this whole thing. I was asked before I read the book, could you imagine if I hated it? That would be terrible. But I didn't. I loved the book. It's fantastic, and I think it's going to be a huge blessing to all of you. So I'm really excited to engage with Matt about the book. The questions I prepared, really the dialogue I hope that we have is really just rooted in my own engagement with this book that I absolutely loved reading. So yeah, happy to talk to you, Matt, Dr. Tuininga. But I wanted to start by just giving you a chance to recognize maybe the people that helped with this. I mean, I know the experience when you write, it can be an isolating experience. Writing can be. Oftentimes you have to sort of tuck yourself away into some dark corner where you're not going to get distracted. But nobody writes a book alone. There are so many people that really help and contribute, and I know you don't have time probably to thank them all. That might take all of our time. But if there's anybody that you want to thank before we get started with the conversation, I wanted to give you an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, thanks. I want to start by thanking just all of you for coming. It's really a joy to me to be able to share this moment with all of you, so thank you for that. Thank you especially to development, as Jewel said, and Laura Paulsrock especially, who did so much to make this happen. And then more personally, I suppose, I would like to thank my parents, who are sitting right over there, Cal and Ellen Tuininga. Maybe you can just raise your hands so people can see you. And my wife, Elizabeth, to whom this book is dedicated. And then my daughter, Catherine, and Sarah, who were actually the first people, along with my son, Joel, to hear this book. So I read the entire thing to them in an earlier form. And if something was too hard for them to understand or they didn't follow it, that meant I had to revise it. And that was a way to get me to write the kind of book that anybody could really read and enjoy. And so they actually did play a very significant role in that. And then my sister Alyssa, who has put up with me for like almost 30 years, telling her history stories that fascinate me. And then finally, I should just say Zachary Kime, my research assistant, who actually did a ton of the work on final process in this book. So he's sitting way back there with his kids.
So I remember when Matt told me that he actually read the book out loud to his children so that they could dialogue about it. And I went home to my own kids and I said, this is what Matt did. So what do you guys think? And they were not enthused about that idea. My kids are 20, 18, and 12, and they just kind of looked at me and thought, that does not sound like a good way for us to spend our time, but I do hope that this was a blessing to your kids, because, again, it was a blessing to me. And maybe instead of mine, I'll read your book out loud to my children. Maybe they'll enjoy that more. Excellent. So I really wanted to start, Matt, by just asking you about the impetus for the book itself. 17th century New England is a fascinating time. Obviously, it's sort of the dawn of the colonial aspect of what we now all know as the United States. So to be sure, so much has been said about it and written about it, and despite that, you still had a particular itch to tell this version of the story or these particular aspects of the story. So what's the impetus here? I mean, you cover about 50 pivotal years in that period, so what drove you to visit these particular events in the detail that you did?
Yeah, so the first book that I had written from my dissertation was based on John Calvin's political theology, so the foundations of the Reformed tradition and its cultural and political engagement. I really wanted to follow how that actually played out and was transplanted in America. So the Puritans were a very obvious focal point because nobody was more self-conscious about being Reformed than the Puritans, and they're driving colonialism. And I was especially interested in how did Reformed people engage in some of these, what we now look back at and see as incredibly painful and tragic moments in our history. What struck me as I was looking at the Puritans was that most of the writing about them was sort of bifurcated into two different categories. There's all these scholars who focus on Puritan religion and Puritan theology and Puritan churches and so forth. but didn't really say much at all about the way they treated Native Americans or what they did with Native Americans. And then there's a whole other group of scholars for whom the Puritans are basically a bunch of colonists, and they focus on Puritan colonialism and Native relations, but really don't understand them as theological people or as Christians and so forth. So what struck me is that the Puritans themselves did not experience life in that bifurcated way. They thought in very Christian terms about everything that they did, including, first and foremost, the way they engaged with Native Americans, which was something that was very a daily thing for them. And so I wanted to bring those two strands back together and tell them as one story. And that comes out a little bit in the title, The Wars of the Lord. That's a term they used. I didn't invent it. They referred to their missionary work among Indians as a war of the Lord because they saw it as spiritual warfare, saving native souls from Satan's tyranny. But they also thought of their literal military conflicts as a war of the Lord because they saw themselves as sort of defending Christ's kingdom from attack. And obviously that creates significant problems. And I wanted people to see how you can't separate those things. You have to grapple with them together.
So the conflicts then are sort of maybe the driving point of a lot of the story. I mean, the story does reveal some of the blessed moments and the good moments between the various groups involved, but the conflicts are really take center stage. One of the things that struck me about your book is that we often think about, I want to ask you about terminology really, we often think about all of these groups of people at the time as sort of monolithic, right? We blend the boundaries between them, we smash them all together. There's just Puritans on one side and Native Americans on the other, when in reality the Native Americans were made up of several different tribes with different cultures and different ways of being and thinking in the world, although there were commonalities. And even among the Puritans, there were different groups in different places and offshoots that were created as they went and founded new towns, and it really wasn't just a single monolithic experience. You already have been reviewed by Christianity Today, and the review is glowing. It's a phenomenal review, and the only slight critique that the person had was on this terminology that you used the word Puritan to describe really all of the people in New England at the time. But in your book, you're very careful not to blur the lines. Why did you still decide in the end that you wanted to use one term, Puritan, to describe them all? And then, and is there anything we lose in that respect? I didn't lose anything because I see the diversity in the book, but what was the driving decision behind the terminology that you came up with?
Yeah, so anyone who knows church history at all, especially about the Puritans, knows that what is a Puritan, what do we mean by Puritan, is and always has been one of the most contested arguments. And there's no agreement on it, and how people view it varies from time and place. For me, the reason I went with the term is because I think it was just important to note that colonial Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth were very much religious societies. They all had state churches, and they were very much in the Puritan Reformed Congregationalist tradition. Their pastors were involved in decisions of state and were consulted about them. Their government officials were required to be members of churches. Many of their leading military officers were also devout Christians, and they all used religious language in everything that they wrote. So to me, it seemed appropriate to say that these are Puritan societies. They are offering theological justifications for what they're doing. They are calling on their people to hold religious services to make sense of why God is judging them through some sort of military conflict. These are Puritan societies. Now, it's true, and this is where the critics come in, that there were many people in these societies, including people who commit some of the atrocities, who are not particularly devout, do not really hold the Puritan theology and so forth in their hearts. That is true, I think that is true of every society. But even those people, that was the language of the day. That was the sort of the default public reason, if you will. And even someone like Benjamin Church, who's often pointed to as obviously not being a Puritan, and he's a leading figure in King Philip's War. But even Benjamin Church, at one point in the story, he's in church, and he gets called out, and it's been discovered that an enemy Indian is close by, and they're calling him to go lead his troops to hunt down that Indian. So he's in church. And he's the guy everyone points to as, well, he wasn't a Puritan, but he's in the Puritan church. So I think it's eminently defensible and actually important to understand why are they doing what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Standish was one of those characters that stood out to me in that respect. Because, I mean, Standish is clearly, at a popular level, probably one of the most famous characters in your book. He's a person a lot of us learned about in grade school, probably. But in Standish's mind, I think he really just thought of himself as a military man, and he was being guided and directed by religious leaders, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that he himself thought of himself in religious or theological terms. He was just a military man doing military work, but he was still doing it on behalf of, I think, a larger Puritan community, and you definitely make that clear. I wanted to ask you in particular then about some of these details as you start to root through and sift through all of these dynamics, the diversity of the communities and all of that. I know because you told me this that, I mean, you could have probably written 3 volumes on all from just this one set of research. Maybe 1,000 pages we would have been wading through and still probably been blessed by all of that material. But you still then made this decision to cut that down into this very manageable 380 pages or so. There's this phrase that a lot of us have in writing communities that's "kill your darlings." Right? So the darlings meaning that when you're doing research, you fall in love with material, you love the material, you write about the material, but then somebody outside of you, publishers and editors, have to come along and say, it's time to kill some of this stuff. And then you have to go back to the drawing board and root through and quote unquote kill your darlings, get rid of the material that you love, but that the reader might not need in the end. So if you had all this material that you loved, but you really had to focus and hone in on what you were going to write about, how did you make that decision? Was there anything that you cut that you kind of wish was still there that's not there? Really just what was that process like for you as you rooted through the material?
Yeah, I knew it was getting too long when my wife said to me, I think you need to turn this into a trilogy. And I didn't think I had the stamina to write 3 books out of it, so I thought, easier to cut it down. But I'll admit that was the hardest part of the process was I had about triple the materials, what made it in here, and cutting that down without losing. I would think of it in terms of stories and people that were important to me. You're writing about real people, and you're telling their stories, and in a way, as a historian, you feel an obligation to them to tell their story right, but also in some ways not to silence them. And then you have to, because you have an editor telling you that you have to. And so, how do you do that without feeling like you're consigning people to be forgotten? And what I had to do is really narrow down the focus on Puritan-Native relations. So early on, I had a lot more about, the way the Puritans treated religious dissenters, let's say, or some of their ideas of how to run the government in general, which are important to understanding the Puritans as reformed people, but couldn't make it into this book. And then another thing that I had to do is so the last third of the book is about King Philip's War, which may have been the bloodiest war per capita in American history. It was like the World War II of colonial New England. It was utterly devastating. And there's a whole part of that war that happens in what's modern-day New Hampshire and Maine. And I eliminated the entire thing. So there's like a few sentences that refer to that. There's been books that have been written about, but I just had to exclude it. And I figure, you can't do everything in one book. People have to look somewhere else. But I do believe that the characters that I highlight, that I am telling their story faithfully, and that was important to me.
Yeah, I mean, some of that stuff will probably sit with you forever, and this is not your first book, so maybe you already know that. I remember with my first one, it was 185,000 words. Mercifully, the publisher only wanted me to cut 10,000 of those. And I still can remember things that I had cut where I think, man, I wish that was still in there, right? So, I don't know, maybe ideas for the future. Maybe there's another book ruminating in there, not to sign you up for that against your will or anything. I wanted to ask you about the way you tell the story, because I read a lot of history, and there's so many different ways to do history. You've chosen what I would describe as more of a narrative format, right? And so instead of just giving us lists of facts, which could get tedious, you're really just telling the story, and you're telling the story through the words of the people who lived it. We have that information available, and you did the hard work for us of rooting through that material and letting them tell the story through their own words. It's almost like an oral history, really, of the events. Did that just come naturally to you? Was there some sort of conscious decision that drove you to doing it this way as opposed to all the different kind of subgenres of history? What made you want to tell the story in quite this way? Yeah,
so there's different layers to that. Part of that is the kind of books I love reading most do that. They're narrative history, and they don't just take a topical approach. They show how people actually experienced something in not real time, but without knowing what was going to happen next. And that makes all the difference in the world for how you evaluate people's actions. I mean, hindsight's 20/20, right? We all look back at our lives and think of things we might have done differently if we had known what would have happened. You know, and so it's unfair to judge the people of the past with the knowledge of what ended up happening. You can't read the whole history of colonialism and racism all back into colonial New England as if they knew all that was going to happen. And so by doing it in a narrative style, not only did I think it would make for a more enjoyable read, hopefully, but I also hope that people would see these events through the eyes of the people that lived them, knowing what they knew, and would evaluate what they were doing on that basis, not on the basis simply of what we know. And of course, you can still do that as like a second act of reflection, but I think it is important in history to first of all wrestle with them on their own terms. And just to give an example, when we look back and we think, this is terrible, colonists are fighting Indians and they're killing them, this is the Indians' land, we all know who the bad guys are in this story. It's very different if you are a mother with children in your house and suddenly you look out your window, and this is a real story, you look out your window and the neighbor's house is on fire and you see people getting shot in front of you and massacred in front of you. What are you going to do? You're not going to sit here and think about the whole situation of colonialism and how am I going to handle this. You're going to try to protect those you love. You're going to hope that your sons and husbands go out and defend you. And I don't think we can judge them for that. I think that's just a human response to that sort of situation. And so it should at least make us humble. We're talking about real people who experienced things and didn't know what the future was going to hold or what was, and also didn't know the whole context. They didn't know what decisions their colonial government had made. They didn't know why the Indians were attacking. Any more than most of us know everything that's happening in Congress or in Lansing or wherever it is.
I think that's a fascinating response in terms of like your driving inclination because of your two roles, right? I mean, a lot of you, as you heard Jewel, or maybe you already know this about Matt, he's not just a professor of history, he's also a professor of ethics. He does both of those things here. And so what you're describing, I think, is interesting to me, just knowing your two roles and the way you have to exist within them. That in particular kept hitting me. So for example, in the book, and earlier I was joking with Matt about trying to avoid spoilers, but how do you really avoid spoilers? This is history, right? It happened many hundreds of years ago. But there is this sense where there's this particularly harrowing event that's often referred to as the massacre at Mystic. And you don't avoid calling it a massacre because that really is what it is. It sounds like a judgment, but it's a judgment that you almost can't help but make. At another point, you not only refer to it then as the massacre at Mystic, but you don't seem to have a problem actually just calling it genocide. And there are a lot of reasons why it becomes an appropriate label to refer to it that way. So I can see you when I'm reading this book, and I'm almost like thinking, trying to get inside your head a little bit. Okay, here's the historian in Matt. Well, here's the ethicist. How did you balance that in particular in light of what you just described in terms of the way you wanted to tell the story? Did the ethicist ever scream to come out on the page? Was this something you had to actively resist telling the reader what we're supposed to think, right? Like I kept thinking to myself, Matt's not making me think a certain thing, but now I wonder what he thinks. Now I want to know. I almost wanted to keep walking into your office and ask you, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? But I hesitated for now. Now that when this event's over, I'm going to ask you lots of those questions. But I hesitated now because I wanted to sort of leave it open-ended. How did your two roles, was there a battle within you as you tried to frame the story the way that you did?
Yeah, so there's a few different things there to try to hit on them on each one, I guess. So I use the word genocide, but I do use it slightly more carefully than you imply. At one point, they signed a treaty after the war, the Pequot War. They force a treaty on the natives in which the name Pequot is banned, and the Pequots are not allowed to live on former Pequot land. And there's a big debate among scholars over whether or not this is genocide. And this followed the massacre at Mystic. I decided to call it cultural genocide because you are trying to eliminate a cultural identity, but they weren't in fact trying to wipe out all the people. And so I think it would be unfair to just call it genocide simply. They didn't think in racial terms like we did. So if these natives were adopted by other tribes, which was the goal, then they'd be wiping out the Pequot culture, but not the Pequots per se. In the Dust Jacket, I refer to it as virtually genocidal. That's my language for King Philip's War, because I think its effect on many of these peoples was essentially genocidal, but I don't think that was the Puritans' intent necessarily. So I try to use that word to be honest about what's actually happening while not oversimplifying it. And then to get to your fuller question, when I first started this project, I thought it was going to be much more evaluative. I thought I was going to have chapters and conclusions where I was evaluating Puritan political theology and what was wrong with it. What I discovered is that the questions were far too complicated for such a simplistic step to be taken. There's just way too many actors who do things for different reasons, and you have to evaluate each decision, each act on its own. So yeah, I have my concerns about Puritan political theology that I could talk about, categories that I think they misapplied or things like that. But in the end, what I wanted the reader to do first, before slipping into critical or evaluative mode, was really to understand. I think in American culture especially, we have this tendency, we like our history like a Marvel movie with heroes and villains. We just want to know who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and then we always put ourselves on the side of the good guys. History's not like that. Good people, some of the best people do some of the worst things. Some of the worst people do some of the best things. And I almost more want us to see ourselves in this book as Reformed people. These are our people. They hold many of our same theology. And these are the things they're doing, and this is why they're doing. As you wrestle with and evaluate that, if I'm showing it to you without telling you what to think, hopefully you'll wrestle with your own life and your own context and evaluate it in the same way. So there's, the desire to show, too, it's more powerful to show something so that somebody learns to think something on their own than to tell them what to think. I want people to feel the pain of what happened and to then have a response on their own. So yeah, I mean, there's more I could say about that, but.
Well, maybe I'll give you a chance right now. I only really have one more question because I want to give everybody a chance to be able to interact with you in the rest of our time. So really just one more thing, but it leads really from what you just were talking about. As I was engaging with the book, I was thinking about the messiness of the people involved. And as I said earlier, I've myself have read a lot on this period, but there were still people in events that you described that even in all of my reading on 17th century New England, I had not really either come across at all or maybe not in the same detail. And for me, one of the interesting characters was Roger Williams. I had found the name in a lot of my other reading, but you describe him and his activities and his endeavors in significantly more detail than I had ever seen it. And I had kind of I went through the ringer with Roger Williams because at moments I admired him and admired his intentions and the things that he wanted to do. At other moments and times, because I started to admire him, I got really frustrated with decisions he was making, right? I really went through it with this character. And so I started to think about, again, with you, the experiences you had with characters and stories, because again, you don't tip your hand to this all that much. But in the messiness of the people, the characters, the stories, as you puzzle over people's decisions, realize how complicated we all are in our own ways. When doing your research, was there one person or story that you want to leave us with that really stood out? Where you could look at it and say, this one grabbed me in a more profound way maybe than the others, or if not more profound, in a more surprising way? Did you look into something thinking, oh, this will take me a day or two to root through it, and then you spent months with somebody? What would be a story you really hope when we get to that part in the book that we pay careful attention to it?
Yeah, so let me just say something about Roger Williams first, and then I'll do that latter part. So, because that helps me reflect on the earlier question, something I should have said earlier. If I had written the book as like the all-knowing ethicist who understands the answers to everything, first of all, I'm afraid that would imply that I have more moral knowledge than I really do, more certainty than I really do. I felt afraid to make certain judgments definitively and wanted to withhold that judgment and let the reader do it themselves. But one way that I could bring I also didn't want to judge them from a 21st century perspective. So one way to get around all of that is have characters in the story themselves offer those criticisms or that evaluation from their own standpoint. And because that gives you a sense of what people in that time could have genuinely thought. And Roger Williams is one of those. I mean, he starts out as a Puritan minister. He's a Reformed pastor. He develops strong concerns about Reformed political theology, covenant theology, things like that. And he ends up getting banished and basically living with the Indians as an Indian trader. But he always remains very devout in his Christian faith. He's devoted to helping save native souls and so forth. And he becomes this constant voice of criticism throughout the book, criticizing what the Puritan authorities are doing, often on very theological grounds. And so that voice of criticism is always there. And he's not the only one. John Eliot, Daniel Goock, and others are offering that voice. Now, yes, you're right. When the rubber hits the road, the battles break out. It's interesting that Roger Williams is always on the colonial side, always. And that is true of all the English. When the fighting starts, they see themselves as defending English civilization and Christian civilization. And I wonder how many of us would be different. I mean, if America went to war with somebody today, and we might not agree with what our government did and how it got to it, how many of us would literally go up and go help the enemy fight America? I mean, probably not most of us. And that reminds you that we're dealing with real people in periods of great crisis and tremendous existential violence and so forth. So using the characters in the story to critique, I think, is a powerful way to get us to think about our own theological perspectives. Now, I appreciate your question about getting to talk about a particular person, because this enables me to give you all a story, I think, that can give you a window into the nature of this book. So, the most famous missionary among the Puritans was a guy named John Eliot. He became known as the Apostle to the Indians. More due to him than to anybody else, the New England colonies were the only place on the entire Atlantic seaboard of all the English colonies where there really was a vibrant missionary effort converting thousands of natives to Christianity. That's not true of any other English colony. So for all the criticisms we might have of the Puritans, they were doing the missionary work. They were changing native lives, and these natives themselves would have said, "You have saved us." You know, many of these natives will end up siding with the English in the war because they see that as their future. So when John Eliot starts doing this work, his method is to go out, preach to Indians, focus on basic themes like warning them of the judgment to God on their sin, and then coming with the salvation promised in Christ. And the goal is to get groups of Indians to come together and agree to submit to English overall governance with Christian laws, and then submit to Christian teaching. And these communities that do this will become known as praying towns. And the most famous of them is a town called Natick. Even then, he hasn't founded churches yet, but the goal is, as these natives are catechized and trained and subjected to Christian laws, they will want to form a church. And so he starts basically training these Indians to go before the Puritan clergy, which is going to be super intimidating, right? English is not their first language. They're from a very different culture. But they're going to confess their faith, and then they're going to get asked questions about how well they understand Reformed theology. And so there's these series of efforts where Eliot is doing that with natives, and all the stuff's written down. So we can read their testimonies. We can read them say how and why they became Christians. We can see what they understood, what they didn't understand. And one of the Indians who does that, and this is the guy whose story I want to tell, is a guy named Tom Wetasikampanum. Now, Wetasikampanum is hard even for me to remember how to say it rightly after writing the book, so you can understand why at the time people just referred to him as Captain Tom. He was also a militia officer. So Captain Tom in 1659 is one of the people who went before the Puritan clergy and confessed his faith, and he described how the epidemics that had swept through native communities had killed his wife and all his children. Then he had remarried, and his second wife had died. And he, like many natives, were gripped with this existential crisis that God is judging me for my sins. And so he, in his confession, he says, "I came to the point, Christ have mercy on me, forgive me for the sake of Christ." And he is brought into the church as one of the first members of the first Native church in Massachusetts, the Natick Church. A few years later, he is a Nipmuc sachem, so that means a chief of the Nipmuc people. And he brings the sachems of 6 or 7 villages to the English, where they say to the English, we want your protection from these other native tribes who are oppressing us. And if you protect us, we also want to submit to your laws, Christian laws, and receive Christian teaching. And so this treaty is signed, and a wave of these Nipmucs come in, and they found a whole new group of praying towns. And then this guy, Captain Tom, is appointed as the native ruler of these towns. So he's the leader of many of the Christian Indians in Massachusetts. When King Philip's War breaks out in 1675, the English are very alarmed that essentially, as one of my chapters is entitled, No Indian Can Be Trusted. So only some of the Indians are fighting us, but we can't trust any of them because Indians are Indians, you know. And you start to see this sort of racist mentality creeping in. So they send out envoys to the native groups that are not part of the war yet and basically say, can we trust you? And Captain Tom leads the Christian Indian response, and he says, yes, you can trust us. We are Christians. We consider ourselves as English. We're not going to fight you. And so they leave it at that. But as the war goes on and more English villages are completely destroyed and their people are killed or taken into captivity, there's this clamor among the colonists to basically round up the Christian Indians. There's this fear that some Christian Indians are helping the enemy. And so what Massachusetts ends up doing is rounding up many of these natives and moving them into islands on Boston Harbor. It's the dead of winter. They're under, it's a windswept island with little food on it, and so some pretty brutal conditions. And hundreds of Indians are huddling here without shelter and so forth. And these are the Christian Indians who'd been loyal to the English. Some of the Indians, including Captain Tom and his group, are still at there's about 200 of them at this village called Hassanemisett. And that's where the second Indian church in Massachusetts had been established. So Captain Tom is leading these. They've not yet been rounded up, but it might be coming. And the enemy comes. The enemy Nipmucs who are fighting the English come to this village in sort of a surprise. They show up and they say to them, look, you have a choice. You can wait until the English round you up and stick you on the island, and you might starve, or they might even sell you into slavery, which they had done to some natives, selling them into the Caribbean and so forth. Or you can come with us. And this is an existential crisis for the Christian Indians because they are well aware that, at this point, they identify with the Christian faith. They identify with the survival of New England as the Christian people that they are part of. And yet, the English are treating them so badly. And so, there's a lot of anxiety here. The native pastors weigh in, and Captain Tom makes the decision on the top of his people, we're going to go with the enemy Nipmucs and trust them to protect us. And he makes that decision, and he sort of stays with them over the winter. They try to recruit him to fight because he's a militia commander, and he refuses to fight. Later on in the war, he escapes with some of his family members, and they end up getting picked up. He's afraid to turn himself into the English because he knows, I'm coming from the enemy. They're going to think I'm a traitor. But he ends up getting picked up by some of the Christian Indian soldiers who were fighting with the English. So they pick up Captain Tom and they take him to Boston. And immediately he is accused of having fought with the enemy. So he's put on trial. And several soldiers say, we saw Captain Tom at such and such a place. I recognized his voice. Or I saw him wearing the very same coat he's wearing now. He was at this battle fighting against us. What's really interesting is, and was pointed out at the time, their evidence is conflicting. It'll be the same battle, and one says he saw him way over on this side of the battlefield, and the other says he saw him way on this side of the battlefield at the same time. So there's good reasons to question the evidence that's being presented, but nevertheless, he's condemned. And the Christian Indian soldiers appeal to the Massachusetts court, and several of the leading missionaries appeal to the Massachusetts court. And the court basically says, well, even if this evidence isn't enough to convict him, he never should have gone with the enemy. The very fact that he chose to go and take refuge with the enemy means that he can't be trusted. And so he's sentenced to hang on Boston Common. If any of you have been to Boston Common today, it's still a green space today. You can see where this happened. And John Eliot is in particular very concerned about this. He's known Captain Tom for decades now. He visits Captain Tom in prison and presses him one last time, were you at that battle? Like, what is the truth here? And Captain Tom makes a compelling case to him. He had been sick at the time. He had witnesses say he was sick at the time. He wasn't there. So Eliot knows that he's convicted, he's going to die. And so Eliot goes to church the next day, Sunday in Boston, the main church. And he's just feeling the weight of this. He's thoroughly depressed. And after the service, he goes up to the governor, who's also in church, the governor of Massachusetts. Again, this is a Puritan society. And he says to the governor, please, can you just give Captain Tom a chance to prove that he couldn't have been in this battle, the Battle of Sudbury? And the governor's like, basically, and this is all coming from Eliot's diary, he says, Captain Tom was a bad man. That's all there is to it. He never should have gone with the enemy. And Eliot looks at the governor in the face and says, at the day of judgment, Christ will show you otherwise, basically. And then Eliot leaves because there's nothing he can do to persuade the governor. I forget if it's the next day or a couple of days later, they're taking Captain Tom to Boston Common to be executed, and Eliot walks with him the whole way. And he describes this in detail. Captain Tom mounts up on the ladder, and they put the rope around his neck, and they knock the ladder out from under his feet. And John Eliot says that at that point, Captain Tom reached out his arms. I do it both, but then you can't hear me. He reaches out his arms, praying to heaven while he's dangling, and then his arms gradually fall. And John Eliot says the word spread around Massachusetts that he had not died like the heathen, but had died as a praying Indian repentant before God. And I just think that's an incredible story. And it captures both the tragedy and in a sad way the beauty of what nevertheless we can say happened there, because Captain Tom suffered incredibly from the English and unjustly. And yet he was saved by the Christian gospel. He never gave up his faith and was testifying it even in this moment where he is being killed. It's a very Christ-like moment. And Daniel Gookin, the missionary superintendent, he's the one through whom we know a lot of these stories, because he's the one who sat down and basically said, I have to tell the story of the suffering of the Christian Indians. No one is going to tell this story. And he talks about his conversations with them. And he compares them to Christ, because he says to them, look, Christ also suffered even though he was righteous. He was also persecuted. And Gookin himself presents the praying Indians as being the Christ-like figures in the story. And the amazing thing through it all is, despite all this bad treatment, they continue to testify to their faith. They continue to remain loyal to Christianity. And my book stops at 1676, but that continues to be true for the natives of New England. In fact, more and more of them will become Christian, and they themselves learn to distinguish the gospel from the abuses of Christians. And I take courage from that in the sense that I think we need to learn to look back at this history and really face up to the tragedies that came about because of what our people did, even when they thought they were doing what was right. We need to face up to that and the tragedy of that. We need to wrestle with how our own political theology might lead us to do similar things. But the good news is that despite the worst that they did, the gospel still was working through that time. It still was saving people. And I think you look at all of Christian history, it's a story of evil after evil committed by Christians. And yet the gospel continues to go out and people are converted. And there's still good news there. There's hope for us. We are not the saviors. Jesus is the savior. And I guess seeing this God's sovereignty for good, even in the midst of times where, again, not us, but our people committed grave evil, to me, is encouraging way to make sense of what happened.
Yeah, it's so odd because you want to call a story like that beautiful, but it's tragic and scandalous at the same time, and that really is sort of the Christian experience for so many of us. I mean, hearing you talk about this, I was thinking about Romans 8, for example, co-heirs with Christ, but who are the co-heirs with Christ in Romans 8? It's also those who co-suffer with Christ. And it is just an indelible part of the story of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But unfortunately, a lot of that is also at our own hands, right? I was thinking throughout your book about these evangelistic and missionary implications of the fact, for example, that the English, in an effort to really reach out with the gospel to a lot of the Indians at the time, had themselves a really hard time distinguishing between Christianity and Englishness. And that this created so much unnecessary conflict because they had a hard time really parsing that. And there are so many powerful stories in the book that help us to understand the conflicts that were arisen just because of this sort of failure on their part to make that distinction. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for introducing this book to us. I mean, I know hopefully you all are encouraged to pick this up and read through it soon. For those of you that are getting your free copy today, but even if you're not, highly encourage you to pick it up. And so real quickly again, for those of you that have registered for a book, only those that registered for it, then your books are going to be in the back, and if not, please remember not to take one. But I do want to end it here because we are supposed to wrap up in 15, 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that you all have a chance to talk to Matt, to ask him questions maybe if you have questions, just to thank him for writing the book, whatever it is. And he'll be over there signing books, correct? All right, signing books, excellent. So if you just want to join me in thanking Matt for his time. Yeah, let me close this out actually with prayer and then we'll wrap up. Father, thank you for this time, for the ability to learn from Matt. I know in my time here at Calvin, in the nearly 2 years I've been here on faculty, I've learned a lot from him and encouraged that I'm going to have so many more opportunities to continue to learn from him. And I'm excited for the fact that you led him to write this book and tell this particular story. And I know for sure that all of those in the room here today that read it will learn as I have. And so ultimately this prayer is just gratitude to you for forming him the way that you have, and for shaping his faith in the way that you have, and for making him the historian and the ethicist that you've made him so that we could all glean these insights. So we're grateful ultimately to you, God, for that, for this work in him and through him. In Jesus' name we pray.